Hello, and thank you for joining us for Women in Autonomy's First to Last Mile Autonomy panel. My name is Jennifer Deutsch. I'm the program manager at Women in Autonomy. And if you're not familiar with us, we're a group that is passionate about educating, equipping, and empowering women in the automotive and auto tech industries to become leaders and change makers so our voices can be better heard and represented. We have several of those leaders here today that I know you're anxious to hear from. But before we do, I want to call your attention to your chat box. That's where you can submit questions for the panel. So we encourage you to keep the questions coming, and we'll get through just as many of those as we can. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator and our panel. Our moderator today is Kirsten Korosec. She's the transportation editor at TechCrunch and co-host of the Autonocast podcast. She'll be joined by Apeksha Kumavat, the co-founder and chief engineer at Gatik, Amy Jones Satrom, the head of operations at Nuro, and Leah Theodosiou-Pisanelli, who leads product, program, and operations functions at Aurora. Ladies, thanks for joining us, and I'll pass it off to Kirsten.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and for the introduction. Before we get started, just like Jennifer mentioned, I'm going to say it one more time because we really want to get questions in, and I'll do my very best to grab those questions early if it's relevant to the conversation. So go to that Q&A box, ask any question, and I will keep my eyes out for that while I'm asking questions of my own. So I thought that this would be a good idea to sort of frame what we're talking about here, because first to last mile kind of covers everything. And I want to start with Leah, but I want to hear everyone's opinion on this. And, talk to me about how the logistics industry is changing, and how does, in your view, autonomous vehicles fit into those changes? A lot has happened, obviously, in the past year. So, feel free to address those more recent changes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, and happy to be here with all these panelists. It's changing rapidly. And I think it was changing even before the pandemic hit. It's just such an industry that's had to kind of ebb and flow with what we're seeing in consumer spending, with the e-commerce boom. There's just a lot happening in terms of what consumers' expectations are in what they're receiving and how goods are moving. So I think if we look at it on the trucking side alone, you're seeing a huge shortage of trailers, even of a need for supply of not only tractors and trailers to move goods between locations because of this e-commerce boom, but you're even seeing the supply chain ripple effect of that. Obviously, supply chains were also have been impacted by the pandemic as well. So it's just a sort of compound reaction. In terms of what does that mean for autonomous vehicles, I think the demand for this technology has only increased. And I think even the acceptance of it and the understanding of the value that it brings has also increased over time. And so I'm now, you put me on the spot, so I'm not going to remember the exact statistic, but there is a study that I read recently about how acceptance, the public's acceptance of autonomous vehicle technology has increased over the pandemic. I want to say 20-something%. So you're seeing kind of this evolution of how people approach the technology. And I think it's because of the need in moving goods. And you could also say the same for people, but focused on logistics.
I want to come back to you in a minute, but I want to turn to Apeksha and kind of build off of that, because clearly there's been a lot of change in demand. But I'm wondering, in your view, and then, Leah and Amy, I'll fit you in here, about how autonomous vehicles are offering that sort of solution. I mean, sure, acceptance is great and demand for it is great, but things like a shortages within the supply chain, for example, or even a shortages of trailers, how do autonomous vehicles fit into that solution? Like, well, how are they solving the problem? There's a lot of demand, but what are they actually solving? And Apeksha, go for it. And then Amy and Leah, I'll circle back.
Absolutely, Kirsten and Leah, spot on. Like the thing is, even before, like taking a step back, even before pandemic, the whole consumer behavior has been, for the past couple of years, it has been dramatically changing, right? No one wants to wait for a couple of days for their groceries or their packages to be delivered to them. The expectation is an hour or 2 hours. Like they want these goods to be delivered to their doorstep, or even like a convenient location close to their houses where they can do curbside pickup. With that increase in the demand from consumers, what has happened in the retail industry is there is a shift that we are seeing in the way goods are delivered from warehouses to the retail fronts. These retailers are essentially like moving their warehouses or fulfill the whole micro fulfillment center concept of moving these dark stores and micro fulfillment centers closer and closer to the consumer's house, and doing these deliveries instead of like earlier. This used to be almost like the inventory replenishment used to happen once or twice every week. Now the customers are like now the retailers are essentially doing that multiple times a day, replenishing their inventories to the retail stores multiple times a day. With that, what has happened in the industry is we need to the form factor as well as the kind of vehicles that do these replenishments the form factors are shrinking, doing these deliveries multiple times a day. That's where and that's one of the things that we are also doing at Gatik is automating these well-defined, very well-constrained known routes that go between these warehouses, dark stores to the retail fronts, automating these routes using our fleet of vehicles that go all the way, start from anywhere from 11-foot to 26-foot box trucks, doing multiple deliveries several times a day, 7 days a week. Essentially, like that's the kind of model that retailers are moving towards, and pandemic has kind of accelerated that process, right? Earlier, that it's accelerating even way beyond than anyone actually predicted post March 2020. And Leah, the statistics, I think there is a stat as well in terms of the consumer demand. It actually increased by 30 to 35% in online business for all the retailers post March 2020. And there has been like this demand is keeping on increasing. There's no turning back into the behaviors that we are seeing from end consumers. So yeah, this has changed the logistics industry forever.
So the presumption then is, and Amy, I want to ask you about this, but so then the presumption would be because of these form factors shrinking, which Nuro is an interesting case for that, but also this changing of the landscape of just how logistics happens, this sort of like hub and spoke system. Do you think that AVs, or are you already seeing an alignment for AVs and that are uniquely positioned to solve it that a human-powered truck wouldn't be able to solve? Or is there something else afoot on, where AVs fit in this? Amy, maybe you can jump in.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting when you think about what has changed and what has not changed in the logistics landscape. I think echoing one of the things that Apeksha said about time becoming important to people. And I think we look at that from two dimensions. One is people spend an awful lot of their time in their cars running errands and shopping and things like that. And people are starting to want that time back. So I think that is something that AV is in a unique position to enable. It prevents that extra trip out to the grocery store or to pick up the dinner, pick up food, things like that. I think there's an interesting safety argument that goes along with that as well. And then I think there's other things too, like for example, during COVID, contactless became a thing. That was something we had talked about previously, but that wasn't something that I think a lot of consumers, it resonated with them. And now with the form factor changing and folks being able to really have a contactless delivery, that's something else that's important to them. And then, one of the things I think that is not changing that much that AVs can help with as well is, the amount of local goods that are bought is still relatively high. And I think you have to look at that in the balance of demand as well. We see pretty spiky daily demand curves. And I think that that's something the AV space can also help solve. It can help alleviate some of those huge curves where there may or may not be drivers that are actually available. And then the last piece, Kirsten, I would just say on that is, I do think there's a long-term argument for the affordability of AV deliveries for consumers. And I would expand that to say, that can also add to accessibility for folks who may not be able to afford some of the fees and things like that today. But longer term, I think there's an argument for that as well.
The affordability piece is interesting to me because we're in many ways, we've made a lot of progress in the last, decade, but then we don't really know what affordability will mean yet, because we don't see commercialization at scale, which kind of, I don't know, am I way off on that? Or would you agree that it's like hard to know what that affordability metric is?
Yeah, I would agree with that today. As you might imagine, we do an awful lot of modeling around it to understand like the big versus small levers and things like that. I do think there's a real possibility that at scale, affordability is a real thing. And I think that's one of the things that excites me about being in the space.
Leah, do you see that happening? You can see the potential for trucking to unlock a supply chain issue potentially. Because of efficiency gains and particularly with the middle mile, if companies, major retailers are reconfiguring the distance between these distribution centers and the size of them to, the neighborhood store. But is there something else before we move on that the other two maybe touched on that you wanted to elaborate as far as like the specific solution that AVs can provide that a human powered vehicle cannot, in reflection with or in conjunction with this changing demand through e-commerce and for just demand for delivery in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think building on that idea of efficiency, there's that idea of predictability, right? Anybody in logistics wants to be able to know that they're going to have supply of drivers to get something from A to B. We've kind of noticed with working with a bunch of different customers across the spectrum, there's a different level of sort of precision of how much advanced planning versus how much is sort of ad hoc. But across the board, everybody wants to be able to predict how many drivers they're going to have, where the trucks are, where the trailers are, so that they can kind of manage their supply chain with that. So in addition to efficiency, there's that sense of predictability that's just not easy to have right now. The other thing I'd add on top, and this is kind of something that Apeksha was saying, is I agree we are seeing this sort of movement of hubs or some form of hub, depending on what you want to call it and who you're talking to, where they get closer and closer to the city. There's always a component, at least to get to those hubs, of high speed, right? And so whether that high speed happens on a truck, whether it happens on a light commercial vehicle, whatever kind of the vehicle platform that's needed for it, as you're looking across this country or globally, right, there's always the sort of high speed and the low speed pieces to get to the different locations as you get closer and closer to the customer. And as some companies build their hubs closer to cities, you see more low speed. But if you want to be able to hit that full swing for these big delivery companies, being able to handle the high speed aspect in trucking, the high speed and low speed activity in light commercial vehicles, and then kind of bringing it down, being able to connect those dots, I think is really powerful for a logistics company that today traditionally has to rely on different types of workforces, vehicle platforms, parts of their business to be able to handle each of those pieces.
So you'll have to remind me of that when we get to the part where I ask you about pain points, because building in a platform that can do that is going to be important.
Sure.
But I do want to sort of get to a question I ask myself all the time, every single time I'm actually writing about one of your companies or the many other autonomous vehicle companies out there? Because the goal always is couched as something as, once we get to scale and once we commercialize at scale. So I do want to get into some of the technical aspects, and we already have some questions from the audience asking sort of more technically based questions. But I do think that it's important to sort of set the baseline. Apeksha, I'll start with you. I mean, what is the true meaning of commercialization? What is the bar that the industry should have? Because it seems to be all over the place. Is it about the number of vehicles that you have in a fleet? Is it about the technical capabilities? Because as we know, a geofence isn't just a geographic one. It can also be sometimes an operational geofence. So how should we be measuring commercialization across the industry, and also for Gatik, but across the industry, what does commercial at scale mean?
Yeah. So first of all, just also addressing something that Amy and Leah covered in terms of just the use of AVs in these different segments. And one of the things that I was getting at with one of the points that I made earlier, with the whole hub and spoke model that these retailers are getting at, that kind of ties with the whole commercial aspect of it and commercialization of AV technologies. It is essentially it depends on what does the business or what does that model look for each and every company is doing something different. They're approaching the problem and approaching the application of autonomous vehicles differently. And one of the things that we at Gatik realized quite early while we actually founded Gatik, one of the things that we were very focused on was the true building a real business around the applications of AV technology. With that, the one thing that we have been very focused about is what makes sense in terms of what is the true application that we can target that can actually bring this technology on roads for the customers, solving the real critical industry pain points, using where the state of technology is right now and in coming futures, growing from there. So with the whole hub and spoke shift, what has happened is in terms of the geofencing, or in terms of constraining the technical challenge, or constraining the autonomy, what has happened is we have these fixed or known, well-defined known route structure where we can essentially deploy our fleet of vehicles. This is something that we have been doing with some of our customers, including Walmart and Loblaws that we have already announced, and there are certain other Fortune 500 companies that we are working with. And the thing that we are doing for them is essentially transporting the goods from their warehouses, dark stores, to retail stores, which is the middle mile as we define it. And that's in terms of commercialization, we see that this is this kind of application, right? Where you have well-defined, that might be operational, that might be technical, well-defined problem. Well-defined problem is something that that the industry needs to focus on, so that that whole process of commercialization is realistic and achievable. So, and we have been at Gatik, we have been doing that for past couple of years. We are essentially, we have these customers whom we have engaged with in multi-year contracts, generating multi-million revenues every year, doing real deliveries every day for them, several times a day, 7 days a week.
Go ahead. What were you going to say?
That's how we see path to commercialization of AVs. It's not about the number of vehicles in the fleet, or the kind of whatever geofencing the company would define it as. It depends on the business case. But actually, the way we see commercialization of AVs is actually bringing them on road, solving a real industry pain point that the customer is looking for. we have been like at Gatik, we have been extremely customer obsessed, and we have been very focused on shaping our product that fits into the existing infrastructure, the needs of the customers, and how do we exactly automate that part of the segment.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm hearing you correctly, and Amy, I'm wondering if you agree, that commercialization and how we measure that and how we rate, because it is going to be competitive. I mean, granted, each of your companies are kind of taking on different pieces of it. So maybe you won't be direct competitors, but you will have others, right? So when we're rating whether a company is commercialized or not, it sounds like the way that Gatik is doing it is also very much tied to their business case. And that should be one of the most important sort of rubrics, I guess. Would you agree with that? And is it even fair for, people like myself, which I'm constantly always trying to figure out where everyone is at, to be thinking of those terms in terms of commercialization? Has a company reached that point or not?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, Kirsten. I guess I think about it in terms of each of the stakeholders that are involved. So I think about it from the customer perspective, from a partner's perspective, and then what you orated from the business perspective. And then also more generally from the public acceptance perspective, because I think that's an important component anytime you introduce a new technology to society. So I think it really starts, I would start at the customer. And I think it starts with the customer wanting the service or the service being desirable in some way. And that could be from a cost perspective, it could be from an experience perspective, it could be from an access to, various partners or the goods at various partners. So I'd say that's like sort of the first bar. Then you have the partner bar, which is what value add are we offering to the partner? Typically I'd say in my experience, that's been your lower cost option that you can offer to them, or a more reliable option, or some combination of the two. And then from the Nuro as a business perspective, when have we reached commercialization? I do think it's related to the business case and how we define that. I think that can have different things that we identify though as success from a commercialization perspective. Like we might start somewhat small and say, hey, we want multiple bots on the road in multiple cities at the same time. And then that could grow from there to say, hey, we know that we're going to have these improvements by X date, at which point we'll be able to generate as much revenue as we're spending and break even, and then scaling up from there. So I think those are all the different things I would take into account if I think about commercialization. Yeah.
I want to ask, there's a bunch of questions we've already received, and I see a few that are related. One is from Michelle Avery. Hi, Michelle. We know each other well, but she's asking what the fastest path to profitability is. Is it low speed delivery segment or high speed trucking segment? And which of those segment of logistics has the most attractive margins? I'm going to make this question a little bit more interesting because each of you fit in a way in those different segments. And so it'd be completely natural and normal for you to say our segment. But I would like to hear you maybe weigh in as to if there is another segment beyond yours that also has a path to profitability. And Leah, I get to ask you this question first. I'm just sticking with all the hard ones. I'm putting you on the spot.
That's good. And I'm even going to push back on the question itself. So I think one thing I would note is while our first product to market will be trucking, it is not the only product that we're working on. And so I think that's actually an important aspect of commercialization and approach to getting there, right? So making sure that as we build a trucking product, the progress is additive. So the same things or majority of the things that we're building in capabilities in that trucking product also apply to a last mile product or a ride sharing product. And so that is something that has been like this idea of an agnostic driver that is agnostic to the vehicle platform it's on or the use case it's in, was something that was in the founding of the company. And you have to have that in mind at the beginning. Otherwise you overfit to one of those options, right? So the reason why, let's say, middle mile has been a focus, and I'll get to the trade-offs too. Middle miles has been a focus is because it's not an easier problem. I will be very clear about that. It's a simpler problem. And we didn't think, we've always been very interested in it, but the big unlock has been, okay, but you need the sensing technology to be able to operate at high speeds, meaning you need this specific type of technology where you can FMCW lidar, where you can see really far away, you can see objects coming closer or moving away from you, and not having interference. Until we felt like we could unlock that with the technology, we didn't feel like we could do high speed. And now that we've unlocked that for trucking, high speed applies to last mile as well, right? And it applies to ride sharing. And so there's a mix there, but to get to the kind of commercialization point, it's by having all of those different products leveraging the exact same hardware suite also has kind of knock-on network effect. And
but you're choosing, sorry to interrupt, but you're choosing,
yeah.
You're kind of going with the trucking, and specifically when you say trucking, you're saying middle mile, but also potentially long, because one would assume that is because it has the best chance in your view currently based on current conditions and available technical technology to be profitable first. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. I think it's a combination of things. It's not just profitability. It's the technology. It's the partner need. It's the demand in the market, right? So it's a combination of factors that led us to sort of slotting that first in line. But it's not like, okay, we launch a truck product and then, okay, now let's all jump to last mile or jump to ride sharing. It's a continuous thing, but you have to focus, right? And so finding a way to focus on what you launch first and deciding what that thing is a combination of factors. One of them is profitability.
Apeksha, I'll let you answer this as well, and then we're going to start going through a bunch of other questions because we are going to run out of time. And we have so many. So the path to profitability question, I mean, without just commenting on middle mile, and please make that argument, what about shorter distances? Is there an argument there? And would you see a path to profitability? Or maybe a better question is, when Gatik was first starting, did they look at that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is something like echoing what Leah said. Focus here is extremely important in this industry. Right now, the thing is, it's not about whether there is a need on the long haul, on the middle mile, or the last mile, first mile, last mile piece. Everywhere there's obviously a need of automation, and that's why we have these all worthy problems to solve. It's more about which one sees the light first in terms of commercialization and profitability. That's the whole question that the industry is essentially looking for. And as Leah said, regarding the long haul, the technology is it's a simpler use case that the technology essentially the technology for that is built in a specific way, for a specific use case. With that being said, there is obviously, like with the whole middle mile. I'll come to middle mile later. Let's first talk about, because I'll keep talking about it. So let's first address the last mile or the first mile, which essentially it has. With the anywhere everywhere use case, once we start talking about the first mile piece, there comes a lot more I would say a lot more variation or parameters that need to be addressed, and it's not just technological. I'm sure Amy would agree to that. There are more of, like, on the operational infrastructure legislation, there are so many of things that need to fall in place for that part of segment to essentially like come to the terms of like commercialization or profitability. In terms of players or the companies that we are seeing in the market. We are seeing like a huge amount of like companies chasing the whole long haul or the coast to coast miles kind of use case, obviously because of the way AV industry came about. Like that's a use case, but very, very constrained use case in that matter. And then we also see on the other end the whole sidewalk and B2C kind of use cases, lower speeds, lower payloads, obviously a really, really great place to see this technology work. The thing that middle mile offers that kind of like it's a really great fit for both the AV technology versus the logistic problem or the critical pain. It is one of the most expensive and most complicated piece of the supply chain. And with the increasing e-commerce demand, it's getting more complicated and complicated day by day, like with the whole shift in the model. The automation in that piece is becoming inevitable for the retailers to actually keep continuing offering goods on demand or in a shorter time. It's just something that there's no other alternative for them if we see it long term. They need to automate those parts of the supply chain. That's where, and from the technological side or from the operation side, it also offers a huge amount of constraints. And it's not, we exactly know what routes, what places are we going to be deploying our vehicles on. So yeah, I think essentially like concluding, that is what at Gatik, I mean, when we founded Gatik, that was the whole reasoning that we had been like very adamant about going after this particular segment of the market. And we have seen it in the past several years, like we are able to deliver, we are able to deploy our vehicles for our customers. Our customers actually see the real value in the use of these vehicles on their routes. And it's not just the ones that we are working with right now, but there's a huge amount of interest from the other customers who are going through the same process of understanding how this model will work from them.
Can I?
Amy, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sorry, if I can just add one quick comment. I think there's an important concept here around utilization as it impacts profitability. And by utilization, I mean, how busy are the vehicles? How full are they? How often are they meaningfully employed? And so, you know, that's one of the things we've looked at pretty extensively in terms of what areas can we service, what is demand in that area, and how do we optimize for, you know, essentially having a very busy full bot most of the time. And I think that that's probably true across all of these industries. And so the faster that you can get to a higher utilization number, I think your path to profitability is probably quicker from that perspective too.
Well, that's like a perfect follow or perfect statement for me to ask my next question, which was, you know, and you kind of hinted at a little bit of it, but I'm sure that there's more to it. You've been operating, Nuro's been operating, and it's been doing some interesting things, particularly around COVID with some of the medical supplies. And so I'm wondering operationally, like, what have you learned? And you commented on the utilization piece. So maybe you can share some of what you've learned on that magic there, but also other areas that you have learned as you've been operating in these pilots.
Oh man, I almost feel like the better question might be, what haven't we learned in the last year?
Okay, well, answer that one. What have you not learned?
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think, you know, COVID has been an interesting time. Essentially, we flipped around a lot of what we were doing as COVID came about, primarily because of employee safety and wanting to prioritize that and make sure we understood the risks of essentially being out in the world more generally. And so we did prioritize using our two robots to support services at the temporary medical facilities in California. And then we were also continuing to do deliveries in Houston, Texas. And so I think, you know, through those, it was really a good forcing function for us to understand the use cases of what we were actually being asked to do, how we actually delivered goods. And in those use cases, I wouldn't say those were good use cases for high utilization. Those were more use cases of, can we deploy our bot for this use case? How do we actually do that? How do we integrate with partners on a very short timeline and make sure that we're all clear on, where does the bot show up? How does it get to its point of drop off, and how does it get back? So I think, although that might sound basic, there were some really good learnings there in terms of, and acceleration in terms of building out, what does the future of our commercial operations platform even need to look like on some level? And then I would say in the real world delivery side, we've learned a lot more. So we've been doing real world deliveries for a little over the last 2 years. And that's been great to really just learn more about how the partners work, learn about, even confirming some of our assumptions in the model around how long are some of these deliveries, like how far do we travel to them? How do we manage SLAs? How do we prioritize which orders we actually accept versus not accept? So from that perspective, there's been a lot of learnings this year. I could also go into a lot of learnings more on the employee side of just how do we ensure the safety of our employees to return to operations. But yeah, because that's been a pretty meaningful body of work for the company too.
I'm sure we could have like an entire panel on how to bring people back to work safely. I want to get to Leah though, and if we have time afterwards, like I'd love to hear everyone's perspective on that. In terms of learning things operationally, I mean, Aurora, I want to change the question just slightly because you're doing a number of things. You've also just acquired a company. And so there's this whole integration piece as well that's happening. So, maybe you can pinpoint what you have learned working with the partners that you've been working with the longest first. And just kind of address that. I mean, because you've now been, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you've been piloting in and around Texas. So in that narrow sort of definition, because there's probably a lot of other things we could talk about, what has Aurora, I mean, I guess maybe what has been surprising that has maybe forced the business side or the engineering side to rethink things a little bit?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are a couple of questions packed in there, but I'll just go.
Do your best. It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I would say on the operational front, yes, we are very busy with the acquisition of Uber ATG, and we're thrilled to kind of bring them into the fold. And you can imagine just the sheer magnitude of integrating that amount of technology, that amount of people, and that amount of process is a lot. And so that's been an active just a couple of months. On the fleet side, one of the things that's been really interesting for me as I've had purview over operations as well is that there's work to be done on like development operations, right? So, and then there's a whole other ball of wax when you're in commercial operations. And so I would say some of the learnings there have been, there are table stakes that you have to deliver for a customer. You need to be there on time. You have to be, you have to do everything just as a normal service provider. And that is a lot of work. And it's sometimes the way you operate as a commercial operator is different from, hey, we're going to run this dev test on this vehicle over and over again in this certain part of, of the city, versus we need to carry this load and we need to carry it on time. And so I think that's been a really fun for me, because I love challenges in making all of those pieces come together. To hit your question on kind of what have you learned from working with partners, I would say deep partnerships are critical. You can have a lot of MOUs, a lot of announcements, a lot of sort of conversations with high-level partners, but the deeper you can go and the more you can align on incentives of what do both sides want to achieve and how are they going to work together to achieve that, and make sure that you're not just solving a problem or a pain point they have today, but that you're working together on what their future is going to look like and what our future is going to look like. So we make sure we build the right thing. Like those have been kind of the most meaningful engagements, and I think will continue to be And so excited in bringing the new team on and jumping into a couple of partnerships that came along with that.
Apeksha, I know you're going to want to weigh in because you've been doing some operational, and just know we have a bunch of other questions. So just let's narrow it to, on the operation side, because you have been doing this now for a bit. What specifically have you learned that has maybe forced you or prompted you to change how you operate, or maybe on the engineering side, you've changed something? Is there something that you can, maybe one or two ones you can specify?
Yeah, I think all the points raised by Amy and Leah, I echo that. Bringing people to the office, as well as like just what Leah mentioned in terms of like deep partnerships, forming those deep partnerships with the customers that we have been working with. That is one thing that we have been like all the customers that we have currently and that we are forming relationships moving forward are not just one-off. We have like made sure that these are not one-off instances of just doing a pilot. These are very well thought of, very well involved customer relationships that we are forming for years to come. One of the things that is interesting for especially like the customers that we are working with right now is that they have been very well educated about the AV space. Even before they formed those relationships with us, they have worked with several different AV companies and have vetted them, went through the diligence process with them. It's very easy to have those communications, those long-term understanding of where the technology is going, where the product is going, and what are the phases of actually deploying and commercialization of this product. It becomes a very easy conversation. That's something that and even like post-pandemic, this is something that we are seeing more and more with other customers as well. Operationally, technologically, it has become something that has become a very easy conversation, at least for the segment that we are operating in, and forming those long-term strategic understanding of what that path looks like.
So there, we have a nice little queue, and there's some are addressed specifically for people. And I think this one is a good one for Amy. What will the knock-on effects be in terms of, for example, packaging of goods? Will we soon share street addresses as QR codes? And this one seems like a very consumer door-to-door type of question. So Nuro would be maybe you're already thinking about this.
Yeah, I think it's tough to predict how like the packaging of goods changes and things of that nature. I think from our perspective, we tried to be more thoughtful about how the bot itself can accommodate kind of the average grocery order, if you will, and some of these other products that we deliver, like anything from just somebody's one set of pills from CVS all the way to a full like grocery order or hot food order. I'm not sure that changes the way the consumer receives the good from a packaging perspective. So I think there's lots of opportunity there, but beyond that, could change in any direction.
Okay. We have two questions. I'm going to ask everyone just because we have so many, which is awesome, but to kind of, let's try to keep the answers a little bit limited. Both questions deal with sort of the technical aspects. So one question is, what do you view as the biggest technical challenge in terms of hardware and sensor technologies in achieving safe and cost-effective AVs for your applications? And the other question that is similar, what is the biggest technical limitation in deploying autonomous vehicles? So hardware and then limitation question. Leah, I'll ask you, and then Apeksha, I'm sure you'll have an answer. And then there's a couple specific Nuro questions that I'll get to next.
Great. So I mentioned this one a little bit earlier, but a big one from our perspective is Fmcw Lidar technology. And the reason why is because you need to be able to see at far distances. You need to be able to detect velocity. So is the thing moving towards you or away from you? But also there's being able to eliminate interference. And so oftentimes traditional LiDARs or cameras will get interference, whether it's from the sun or from other devices. And so for us, that's been a big technology unlock. we acquired a company that built these Lidar. We have them on our vehicles and we're operating them today. The next step is being able to build them at scale so that they can fulfill the fleets of our future.
Apeksha?
Yeah, I would echo that. That's one of the things that I think is something that the EV industry in general is kind of like struggling with, the long range perception sensor suite that could solve those problems. And at Gatik, this, like with the segment that we have been operating on, that has not been a problem so far given the speeds, but as we scale, we see that being one of the things that we would have to address. We have been working with very, very accomplished, very awesome partners in this like sensor industry that have been making progress in that direction. And to be honest, like I think there was a underlying question about affordability in terms of the sensors. I think in general, the overall sensor industry, given the amount of work and the amount of companies that we are seeing, there has been a trend already that we are seeing in terms of the price reduction and the affordability of these sensors for the AVs in general. The other point that I would like to bring here in terms of what has been a challenge, and as well as like a thing that we have been focusing on, is bringing the actual OEM level, the drive-by-wire systems or the actuation systems for these vehicles, making them L4 level 4 capable. That's something that's like for the vehicles that we have been using, like the light to medium duty commercial vehicles, that has been a missing piece in the industry. We have been working with an OEM since last year. We have partnered with an OEM since last year and are co-developing an L4 platform specifically for this use case. We will be announcing this partnership soon, but they are one of the largest OEMs in the LCV medium commercial vehicle sector globally. So yeah, that is one of the I think items on the list as well.
Yes. I'm sure you want to share that name of that company here, right? No, okay. So Amy, this is actually, you had mentioned COVID, and one of the questions from Josephine is, with COVID complicating on-road testing practices, most autonomous system testing requires a safety driver or two. I know that in Nuro's case, with the R2, that's humans don't fit in there, but there is a lot of human interaction involved in that. And I'm wondering, the question is, what role did simulations play in this? Was it sufficient for pushing forward development? But this might be a good opportunity to talk about how you just operationally dealt with balancing safety and technical progress with COVID going on.
Yeah, it's a great question. Simulation absolutely played a role in it for us. So just to give a little bit of context, we initially shut down all of operations. And in credit to our software engineers, they stood up an entire simulation pipeline that operators could do to provide meaningful feedback reviewing scenes. And so through that evaluation, our software stack was able to continue advancing while we navigated, okay, how do we put employees back in the workplace? What are the safeguards we take? Everything from the simple like temperature monitoring and things like that to figuring out, hey, if we do have applications where two people are in a car, how does that work? What are the safeguards around it? Do we have like a screen between them? And how do we make sure that they have not a lot of potential for exposure? So simulation absolutely played a big part in that. And the interesting part about that is that process continues today. So we use that in parallel among our operators, similarly to what we do on road. And then I think to comment on your second part of that, Kirsten, just like, how did you get back to on road in general? It was a pretty slow, gradual ramp back. Being able to support those temporary medical facilities really almost was a forcing function for us to figure out how we do that safely. So we actually started in reverse with the R2 and these applications first. And then we went back on road with our pre-I.
Got it. Leah, this is a question specifically for you. And I think actually you might need to change it up a little bit, but so Aurora is considering caravans of EV trucks, which I don't think is actually the case, but maybe I'm way off here. the question was, is Aurora considering caravans of EV trucks to gain efficiencies? For example, I'm thinking of multiple EV trucks all synced and going at the same speed, where maybe the first one has a human driver that controls the caravan's pace. So the question is, are you doing that? If not, comment on that. And I know, Apeksha, you are starting to get into EVs a little bit. So, once Leah is finished, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that as well.
Yeah, so I think this person is describing like truck platooning, which is not something that we're doing. It's certainly something we've looked into and thought about in the context of deciding what our product vision is, but platooning has not been something that's been a focus of ours.
Just briefly then, have you considered EV trucks? I know that they're more theoretic right now than in of long haul, I should say, not on the middle mile sort of box truck form factor, but in the smaller, like either on the ride hailing side when you eventually get there, and or on the middle mile, have you looked at EVs? Or are you really kind of focused on other efficiencies right now beyond the, powertrain?
Have absolutely looked at EVs, and it's something that we really care about for a platform of the future for us. There are constraints in what platforms are available and where things are in the timelines in each respective OEM's roadmap, but EV, all forms of alternative of energy, right? We're looking at all of it because it's really important that we're building the product for the future here. So yes, it is of keen interest to us on all vehicle platform types.
Apeksha, I know that you, Gatik recently now is using or starting to fold into the fleet some electrified box trucks. And so address that question, but also there was another question for you, and I think you can bring them together. One was a question asking about whether the defined route that you're working on between the warehouses and retailers, are they on public roads? I think I can answer yes, but you can elaborate. And is it with a safety driver or fully autonomous with a teleoperation or some other kind of feature? So maybe you can combine that EV question and just the operational public road, fully driverless question.
Yeah, I think both of those we have recently, like in the past couple of months, have announced as part of as part of our strategic announcements. And I'll start with the electrification first. So that's more driven from the customer. It's a customer-driven shift that we are seeing in general. And with the recent events, there are certain emission goals that all our retail customers are kind of like aiming for. Our move towards electrifying our fleet of vehicles is in that direction. What we are essentially offering is trickling down to at the end to our customers' roadmaps. With that, we had been in discussion with Walmart for past since last year about this whole electrification of the fleet, and there have been other customers as well have similar have echoed similar asks, and we saw that was the whole reason why we kind of went in that direction. And we have recently announced the 3 electrified vehicles that have been deployed in Louisiana with Walmart, and we would be seeing more in the coming months as well. The one thing that we kind of learned in that process is that electrification for middle mile is a perfect fit, given the amount of range, the range that these vehicles travel, the kind of payloads that these vehicles carry. The other good part about this segment is the trips that are made and the idle time in between for loading and unloading processes. That's a perfect time for recharging these vehicles. So there's absolutely zero downtime that these vehicles have to face for recharging and through the electrification process. On I think the second question was regarding the whether there is a safety driver on seat or not.
Right.
Yep. So currently, currently all the vehicles that we have deployed for our customers do have a safety driver. The thing that one thing that we had started, like the one thing that when we started working with Walmart and some of the other customers as well, that one thing that has been on our roadmap is going through phases of operations for removing the driver from the driver's seat. We have been working with Walmart. Our vehicles have been deployed on the routes in Arkansas for past more than 1.5 years, 1.5 years, and what we have seen, we have gone through the phases that we had set forward with, and a huge part of this was working with Walmart to get those, like, not just technologically, but operational metrics taken care of as well. We have seen a huge amount of exhaustive validation in the domain. And with that, we are in the next phase. We are going into the next phase of removing the driver this year. So we'll be essentially making those announcement in more details in the coming months, but that's the roadmap that we are following.
So Amy, I know that the R2 and then the next generation comes after that. You can't fit a human being in there, right? So there's the driverless question has been answered, but maybe you can briefly address sort of how electrification fits in your product roadmap. But more importantly, after you briefly talk about that, I have a question, right? I think well suited for Nuro, which was what focus is Nuro putting on policy and regulations to enable use cases and commercialization? And I know Nuro has been super active in this area. So maybe you can address both of those before I, reach out to Leah and Apeksha on that.
Yep. So our robot is a fully EV robot. So we're in that cycle already, and we've been, testing in that manner. So I think that answers that part of it. I think one of the interesting things there is how that evolves and how AC charging versus DC charging, and how you charge. Do you charge in between orders? Do you not charge in between orders? How many hours of operation do you get? Things of that nature. So I think we'll see that continue to pretty rapidly evolve. And that's one of the things we're looking forward to learning this year as well, as we put the robot on the road doing more commercial deliveries. And I think, Kirsten, that relates into your second question, which is from a policy perspective, sort of, A, do we have a focus there? Yes, absolutely. And then B, what do we do in that space? So this is not my general domain, but happy to kind of comment on it loosely. The company has had a huge focus there since the very beginning. We were very excited to receive our commercial deployment permit the end of last year from the California DMV. And so that will enable us to do autonomous vehicle delivery services in California. So that is something we're really looking forward to doing this year with our robot, and gaining more of those learnings. And then to loop it back to the EV to really understand the battery life and how that does based on what the different delivery profiles actually are.
I think my audio wasn't working very well earlier, so sorry to the audience. Okay, we have 3 questions. I'd like to try to get them all. First one is, I'm curious how the panelists are thinking about safety for AVs, vehicles, robots, and other road users, like driving, walking, biking. Are there specific metrics you're tracking or any specific challenges you're working to overcome? There's a lot packed in there. So let's try to maybe narrow it. So when it comes to safety, I know you're all thinking about safety because you've all talked to me about it quite a bit. Let's focus on that metrics piece. What are the specific metrics that you're using to determine, how, if your testing and if your eventual deployments are safe enough? And Leah, why don't you kick that off?
You love giving me the hard ones. Okay.
I know.
Yeah, sure.
Well, they all have to answer them.
No, I'm teasing. No, it's good. I think two parts to this answer. One of them, and we touched on it a little bit before, is the importance of simulation, right? That plays a huge role in safety. That plays a huge role in rolling out this technology to the road, right? So making sure that not only are you leveraging a robust simulation system, but also that the tests that you are running your software through the paces of are representative of the real world, right? So there's a lot of work there. In terms of sort of safety metrics with the road, what I would say at the highest of levels is we're not going to remove the driver from the car until we can prove that it's safer than a human driver. And so what kind of sub-metrics get into that is for a much longer conversation that I don't think anybody here has time for, but that's the North Star, right? And so then how do you make sure that all of the work you do developmentally make sure that you get to that end goal before you hit that milestone?
Amy, do you want to weigh in before we move on to Apeksha with that one?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty similar to what Leah explained. Like we use a combination of simulation metrics and on-road metrics. Simulation is really informative from understanding the potential for severity of the collision. So there's various metrics as it relates to that. And then from the on-road side, I would say we really use our pre-eye with a safety driver inside to understand exactly what those safety metrics are. So not just like, fortunately, we don't have very many accidents. So not just accidents, but really looking at behavioral events that occur, really looking at what is called miles per disengagement. You can see that in some of the public reports that get filed, but understanding how often we have to disengage the autonomy system. And then really reviewing those on the back end to say what would have happened if that didn't happen, and understanding the severity of that. So I think really triangulating between those two things is super important, and seeing performance level of the system from a safety perspective where we want to see it before we deploy our robot is sort of simplistically how we think about it.
And just a quick follow-up on that. So my assumption would be that if there is a disengagement, and particularly maybe an unusual one, then in the real world, are then you putting that back through simulation? And okay. Yep. And then Apeksha, I think that you probably do a lot of these many different things, but if there's one or two that are different or different approaches, please highlight those.
Yeah, I think this is echoing what like Amy and Leah have already said. Simulation versus onboard metrics. Obviously, all of those are something that we at Gatik also are kind of using. The thing that differentiates that's very specific to the kind of segment and the use case that we are targeted towards is this whole concept of having fixed known routes, right? Like the constrained autonomy is a big part of it. The safety argument has an underlying assumption that there is some form of validation that's been done on the operational domain, and to an extent, as like Amy and Leah said, where you have that confidence that the system is performing equal or better to a human would, right? That amount of validation itself is a huge task in itself. There's so much of different cases, edge cases and normal scenarios that need to be we need to validate it for, and that's where like constraining and having that fixed route, known route use case kinds of comes into play for us. For example, the whole phased approach that we went through with for our routes in Arkansas, Bentonville, is we have been validating our technology on that known route for more than 1.5 years, just on that couple of miles that we have. The way we see the safety argument as well as removing of the driver is route by route and side by side. We kind of have this approach of whitelisting the deployment sites that we have with the customer, and we have those phased milestones with them that essentially like allows us to give a very good metrics on where the system is and how the product performs on those routes, and that gives us the confidence of safely and reliably remove a driver from the driver's seat.
Okay. Well, I wish I had more time because I have a bunch of follow-ups for all of you on those, but we're left with 2 questions. I'm going to ask the one, and I want you to think about it before you answer, and then they're both fun, and they're both also like, I'm going to put you on the spot by asking it. Leah, I promise I won't start with you first. One is, what are you reading to keep up on the industry news and continue your learnings? Of course, besides reading TechCrunch and listening to the Autonocast podcast, that's the assumption, right? So that was one of the first questions we got today, and I wanted to make sure to get to that. So think about that and maybe share your thoughts at the end. And then the biggie, which is perfectly broad and great, it could go a lot of different directions, is from Mingwen Chen at Apple. And the question is for all speakers. What do you see the challenge and opportunity for the AV industry in the next 5 to 10 years? So that's a broad one. Leah, I won't start with you. Amy, I will start with you on that one. So challenge, opportunity, next 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of them, but maybe pick one for each and then we can cycle through.
Yeah. I feel like we talked a lot about sort of opportunities at the beginning. So I'll try to pick one of those. I think challenges in the general sense, I think there's still public acceptance and policy challenges. We were just talking about that. So there's, we've tried to be very thoughtful about that in terms of how we engage the local communities we're operating in, how we engage the policymakers and things of that nature. But there's a lot yet to be defined in this space, even as it relates to building a unique form factor vehicle, for example. And what specifically from a hardware perspective are the requirements as you start to look at that. So I think that's going to be one of the unique challenges in this space over time. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. And then the last question, Kirsten, was news that I'm reading.
Yeah, and I, think about that while we go through Leah and Apeksha on the other ones. Apeksha, I want to ask you about this one next, that challenge and opportunity one, because I think it's well known that like public acceptance and policy are, or maybe it's not that well known, but it's definitely like one that we hear about. But one that hasn't really been addressed is whether software development is a challenge, is like if that's a remaining technical challenge. And as CTO, I think maybe you can answer and address that one. What do you think? Is that still a real challenge in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so it depends, right? Like it depends on what that use case is. The final end use case of that technology is like one of the things that when we started Gatik, all three co-founders, we come from a deep technical backgrounds, have spent several years working in robotics, AV industry, mobile robots. And one of the things that we know how hard this problem is. And the one of the things that we decided very early on is the target market, like how does this technology work for the actual use case, right? So it's the answer here is depends on what is the end use case, what is this technology built for? One thing that we are not doing is we are not solving for general autonomy at Gatik. We are essentially very focused on a very particular segment and have built our software stack and our technology very focused on that application. So and in terms of like in general about the challenges that I think regulations is one of the biggest things that we see in the next 5 to 10 years. It's too fragmented right now in terms of the policies and regulations. It's very state by state. And one of the things that really needs to happen as the companies and as the products scale is having a more standardized legislation at the federal level is one of the, I would say, challenges. And from a technological viewpoint, there's one more that I think a lot of companies are now kind of moving towards is essentially solving for not just the fair weather conditions, but more inclement and harsh weathers, areas, geographies that do not like support the perception or in general, the AV technology. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Leah, I'm sure you have something to say about all those areas, and in particular, wondering if you see, regulations being in the use case for, let's say, frame it around Aurora instead of just the AV industry as a whole, though feel free to comment on that as well. If you really see it as a biggest challenges for the company on the policy side and regulatory side, or just kind of the business case side, because that was one thing that hasn't been brought up yet.
Yeah, so I see all challenges as an opportunity, right? So there's absolutely work to be done in working at federal, state, and local level to make sure that this, technology can make it to market in a commercial way. I think of this less as I don't think about this as we need regulations to accept it, or we need to go, change everything to make sure that it perfectly prescribes the technology we want to deploy. I think this is about education and alignment. And that's where I see the opportunity of, and I don't even like using the term education. It's more about working with folks to understand what is the benefit we can bring here, and how do we bring it to market in a way that people are comfortable with, and that it fits kind of within the spirit of what regulators and policymakers were focused on when they created these laws and regulations and policies. So it's not a deal breaker to me. It's something that needs to happen, and early and often engagement is something that's been really important to us. As a former government official myself, it's something that I happen to care about quite a bit. So it's not a deal breaker, it's an opportunity. And we all have to be in the conversation to get this technology out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one big takeaway from tonight, and thank you everyone for coming, is that it seems like that oftentimes what happens is there's this very wide swath that is placed upon the AV industry as a whole. And each of your companies is very specific with a very specific use case. So we could do a one-on-one with each one of you and do a deep dive into, tell me why this works in this case, and really kind of argue your case. And so sometimes these questions are difficult, but I think the takeaway is that the business case and that utilization, which Amy, you brought up earlier, really matters. And the companies, tell me if I'm wrong, that are going to survive are going to be the companies that really understand the utilization piece and the environment that they need to be operating in, and completely own that first before trying to, again, do literally everything or, apply it in a way that some other company that's doing a very different business case is applying. I mean, would you say that that's fairly right?
Yeah.
Am I on the right track?
I completely agree. I think know the problem you're trying to solve. Be able to talk about that problem with everybody who's involved in it, and focus on first principles and focus on solving it together, right?
Mm-hmm. So just to finish, anyone have any other suggestions? If people want to learn more about AV industry, and if you have a favorite go-to, maybe trade mag or podcast or, blog or something like that, where do you go to learn more? And what would you recommend other people do?
Wait, what? Is there anything else than TechCrunch? I think. I would say TechCrunch, and then there are very good articles that people, like companies themselves, have been very vocal about on Medium as well. So I think that has been the blogs and Medium posts have been something that.
So would you recommend, I guess to wrap up, do you find that you learn a lot by actually reading what other companies are doing on their blog posts, that as someone who's in the know within the industry, that there's enough new information that you can get some insights into what they're doing operationally?
I would say it's more about the perspective or the way the thing that someone wants to say in their own language. The perspective that they're sharing is kind of useful in forming a knowledge base beyond the traditional media outlets. Has been very fulfilling, I would say. Yeah.
And I was kidding about TechCrunch. Obviously, yes, I work there and it's great, but there are a lot of really great other places. I think of IEEE, Spectrum IEEE, sometimes for technical deep dives. We have a couple of other suggestions, transport topics from Allison, and Josephine said she found that VSSAs to be helpful as well. And I think that collective, what I've found is, because I get asked this question all the time, is it's actually sometimes just following people on Twitter and then going and engaging them and then learning from that. It's sort of everything and above. There isn't really just one place where you can find it. And if anything, there's a lot of media outlets where you can get sort of some misinformation about what is autonomous vehicles or automated driving. And so that's a work in progress. But Yeah, thanks so much for everyone. Thanks for the suggestions on the reading or what to read from the audience. And Jennifer, I think we're way over time by 15 minutes. So I'm going to hand it back over to you. And oh, of course, the Trucks VC Future of Transportation newsletter. I should have said that before.
Good one.
That's a good one.
Well, thanks, Kirsten, for moderating such a great panel. You're a complete pro. And thank you to Leah, Amy, and Apeksha for your incredible insights. It is truly an honor and privilege to put on these events and to grow this community. So we really appreciate your participation and for all of you who joined in today. We do want to let you know about a new leadership series that we're launching next month. It's called Women at the Wheel, and it's a series of career conversations with some of the women that we feel are driving the future of automotive. It will be hosted by Dr. Rana L. Calliope, the founder and CEO of Affordability. You might also know her as the author of Girl Decoded, and she's a fierce advocate for diversity and inclusion in tech and leadership. That live stream kicks off on March 16th, and our first guest will be Jennifer Haroon, who is now an executive in residence at Greylock, and she's the former COO of Nuro. So you can follow Women in Autonomy on social media or sign up for our mailing list to get more information. And we hope you'll join us for that. And after this, you will be receiving a survey link when you log off. And we hope you'll take a few minutes to give us some feedback so we can continue to improve our events. And with that, thanks again for everybody. And we hope we'll see you next time. Good night.
Thank you.